Hello, I'm Jennifer Allen. Thank you so much for having me. I just graduated from MIT. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm an incoming assistant professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. So I have all of these affiliations here. And I'll be presenting a project on quantifying the impact of misinformation and vaccine-skeptical content on Facebook. And this is joint work with my collaborators Duncan Watts and Dave Rand. For some reason, I'm having a little trouble here. Okay, there we go. So I think everyone in this room is very aware that misinformation has been implicated in a wide variety of societal challenges. So, starting in perhaps 2016 with the emergence of fake news as a phenomenon, and the implication that fake news helped potentially swing the election for Donald Trump. And then, of course, in the 2020 election, where almost a third of Americans still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And it's not just in the political sphere where we see this potential impact, but also within public health, where 1 in 5 Americans remain vaccine resistant when it comes to the COVID vaccine, and then also other vaccines spill over as well. And so, given this phenomenon, platforms have started investing in solutions to curb the spread of misinformation online. And so one major solution that platforms use is third-party fact-checking to identify, debunk, downrank false stories on their platform. And so Google, YouTube, Meta all have third-party fact-checking programs that identify and label and curb the spread of false content on their platforms. And fact-checking is great. There's a lot of evidence that show that corrections work and lower people's belief when people see them. But there's a limitation with fact-checking, and I think that this example will make that clear. And so this story here was a story that was flagged by Facebook's third-party fact-checkers as false. And the title here is "Canadians Face Major Donut Shortage After First Day of Cannabis Legalization." Whereas this story here, military ballots found in trash in Pennsylvania, most were Trump votes, was not flagged as false by Facebook's third-party fact-checkers. Because in fact, the story was not outright false. Military ballots were found in the trash in Pennsylvania. Most were for Trump. But what this headline failed to mention was that there were only 8 votes found. 6 of them were for Trump. And by no accounts was this evidence of widespread voter fraud in the lead up to the election. Nonetheless, this story was viewed over 100 million times on Facebook and was actually the most viewed URL on Facebook in the lead up to the 2020 election. And it wasn't just this one story. There are many other stories covering this exact incident by mainstream outlets as well. And so when we look at this example, do we really feel good about people not seeing this story and instead seeing stories like this? These stories might not be flagged, they might be true in some narrow definition of the word, but do we really think that that's a good thing? Also, I think relevant to this discussion is this idea that actually, despite all of this conversation around fake news and misinformation, fake news actually makes up less than 0.1% of overall information consumption. And so this is a figure from our Science Advances paper that came out in 2020 that quantified people's information diets. And fake news is of the Pope endorses Donald Trump style variety, is a minuscule amount of what people are actually seeing on a day-to-day basis. And so, given this background, I want to reconsider this premise that I think a lot of our research stems from, which is how much does online misinformation actually contribute to societal level harm? And obviously, this is a very difficult question to answer, and I am not going to do a perfect job in any sense of the word in a 20-minute presentation. But what I think I'm going to do is present a framework for starting to quantify this and understand to what extent is misinformation of the Pope endorses Donald Trump fake news, false story variety really an outsized problem. And I'm going to zero in on one particular example of a phenomenon where misinformation was implicated on social media. And that's the COVID vaccine. And so, 1 in 5 Americans refused vaccine for COVID, despite it being safe and effective for almost everyone. And there was kind of widespread agreement at the time that it was misinformation on Facebook that was driving, and other social media platforms, that was driving this hesitancy. And so Biden was quoted as saying that Facebook and others were killing people by carrying COVID misinformation on the platform. And so the question that I'm going to consider in this talk is, is this correct? Did misinformation on Facebook have a meaningful impact on US vaccine hesitancy compared to content that was not flagged as misinformation? And so rather than looking at misinformation in isolation, instead what I'm going to try to do is estimate the impact of a broad variety of vaccine-related content on Facebook, estimate the resulting hesitancy, and then back out, or actually not back out, but estimate how much of that hesitancy is attributable to exposure to misinformation, the flagged misinformation on Facebook. To do so, I'm going to kind of introduce a framework for quantifying impact. I'm going to do that by breaking down this idea of impact. So what impact did content on Facebook have on US vaccine hesitancy, and which types of content had the biggest impact, as being related to two key components. The first is exposure. What type of COVID vaccine-related content are people actually seeing on Facebook? And the second is the persuasive effect. Did it change people's minds about whether or not to get a COVID vaccine? And the intuition behind this framework is that for content to be broadly impactful, people have to see it, and then when they see it, it has to change their minds about whether or not to get a vaccine. And so it is really the combination of these two things that I'm going to say constitutes impact for this talk. Okay, so just to give an overview of where I'm going. First, I'm going to talk about this exposure component and talk about how we quantified exposure to 13,000 Facebook vaccine-related headlines on Facebook during the first 3 months of 2021, during the initial rollout of the COVID vaccine. Then I'm going to talk briefly about this persuasion component. And I'm going to talk about 2 randomized survey experiments that we ran that measured the treatment effects of 130 different vaccine-related items on people's future intentions to get a COVID vaccine. Then I'm going to talk about a pipeline that incorporates crowdsourcing and natural language processing to extrapolate the results of these survey experiments to this larger set of Facebook headlines in order to get predicted treatment effects for all Facebook headlines in our data set. And then I combine these Facebook headlines with the exposure data, put it all together to get an estimate of the overall impact of Facebook content on vaccine intentions for both misinformation, flagged misinformation, and not flagged content, respectively. Okay, so now moving to talk about the data. So for this exposure component, we used the Facebook URL shares dataset, which is a dataset that was made available by Facebook that contained information about all URLs publicly shared greater than 100 times on Facebook, and then the number of views that those URLs received. And these views were actually deduplicated on the user level. So this is actually the number of people who saw each URL. From this data set, we identified 13,000 URLs that were about the vaccine that were posted during the first 3 months of 2021, during the initial rollout. And then for each URL, we have the number of views that the URL received in the US, the title and description of the URL, so textual information about the URL, and also information about whether the URL had been flagged as misinformation by third-party fact checkers. And so this is how we're going to operationalize misinformation, was it flagged as such by Facebook's third-party fact checkers? And Facebook's third-party fact-checking program specifically emphasizes debunking content that is provably false. So things that have no basis in fact, where there is kind of evidence contradicting the claim of the article. So that's on the exposure side. On this persuasion side, we ran 2 randomized survey experiments on Lucid that tested the effects of 130 different vaccine-related stories on about 20,000 different subjects. And this was representative of online Americans on Lucid. The stimuli in this experiment were drawn from a large sample of popular vaccine news, sourced mainly from Facebook, that contained both misinformation and factually accurate content. And so it was kind of just broadly representative of the types of vaccine-related content that was popular on Facebook. And for each of the headlines, we estimated the persuasive effect of exposure to a vaccine-related headline compared to a control content on people's future intentions to get a COVID vaccine. And so this is what this looked like, or this is what the stimuli looked like. We had things from a variety of different sources. We had high-quality news, low-quality news, and people just saw the headline and leads of the article as if they were scrolling on Facebook, because we didn't, over 90% of articles, or people don't click, people only click less than 10% of articles on Facebook, and so most of the time people are just exposed to the headline. Okay, so we have our exposure data, we have our persuasive effects. Our goal now is to extrapolate these treatment effects to these 13,000 Facebook headlines using a pipeline that incorporates crowdsourcing and natural language processing to get predicted treatment effects for each of these Facebook headlines. So we're able to say, if people were coming across this on Facebook, what is our estimated effect of how it would have influenced their decision to get a vaccine? I'm not gonna, I'm gonna give kind of a high-level overview just in the interest of time, but if people are interested in this process, I'm happy to talk more, Q&A or after, or it's also in the paper. Okay, so first on this crowdsourcing component. We asked, solicited lay people and asked them to judge whether or not they thought a given headline would increase or decrease people's willingness to get a vaccine on a 1 to 5 scale. And then we averaged together these crowd judgments and used these crowd judgments to predict the real treatment effects. And the idea here is to ask, is it possible for crowds of lay people to identify what types of headlines are induce vaccine hesitancy? And so, can crowds predict these treatment effects? Turns out, yes, they can. And so on the x-axis here, we have the crowdsourced aggregate score, so these crowdsourced judgments. On the y-axis, we have the observed treatment effects. The colored points are each of the 130 different treatments. And even though each treatment is measured with sampling error, once you account for that error, the crowd actually does a very good job at predicting which headlines would increase versus decrease people's willingness to get a vaccine. One thing to note here, though, is that if you split this crowdsourced score at the midpoint, there is a lot of content that is lowering people's willingness to get a vaccine, and essentially nothing that is increasing people's willingness to get a vaccine. And this is, I think, consistent with a lot of the research that shows that people update more on negative information when considering risks. And so this is not a particularly atypical pattern, but I think it's one that's notable. Just to show you what I mean here, we see that this story here, this misinformation story about the DoD and Fauci getting caught in a massive scandal hiding death and damage from COVID vaccines, crowds thought this would lower people's willingness to get a vaccine, and it indeed did so. Same with this story here by the BBC, Lisa Shaw, presenter's death due to complications of a COVID vaccine. This is not a false story, but nonetheless, it lowered people's willingness to get a vaccine, and people thought that it would do so. However, this story about Joe Biden getting an additional COVID booster had no effect on people's willingness to get a vaccine, even though people thought it would increase people's willingness to get a vaccine. And so given this, we're really just going to focus on the negative stuff for most of the talk. And so that's all well and good. It seems like crowds can identify negatively persuasive content. But the problem is that crowds are not sufficiently scalable. And so maybe we could use crowds to label the 13,000 headlines in our particular data set. But if we want this to be a system that platforms can use to track content online, then crowds are not scalable enough to do that. So as a solution, we gathered crowd labels for a sample of headlines and then trained a BERT model to predict the crowd labels from the headlines and descriptions of the stories, from the textual elements of the stories. And again, not going to go too into details, but this model does a pretty good job at predicting these labels. And so we have, at this point, we've used our pipeline that incorporates crowdsourcing and natural language processing to get predicted treatment effects for all of the headlines in our data set. And so what do we see? What do we find? So first I'm going to show the predicted URL treatment effects for content that was flagged as misinformation versus content that was not flagged as misinformation, conditional on exposure. And so these are just the predicted treatment effects from our model. And this is what we see. And so you look at this and you see, okay, misinformation seems like it's the problem. When people see it, misinformation is predicted to lower their willingness to get a vaccine by 1.3 percentage points for a typical piece of misinformation content, compared to essentially a null effect for this content in blue that is not being flagged as misinformation. But what happens when we weight this distribution by the exposure each URL received on Facebook? It's actually a totally different story. And so there are many URLs that are not being flagged as misinformation that are about as negatively persuasive as the misinformation was, that are being seen vastly, vastly more times and are not being captured by Facebook's flagging fact-checking system. And so we call these headlines that are lowering people's willingness to get a vaccine despite not falling into this category of misinformation, vaccine skeptical. And so we're going to use this term to refer to this kind of gray area content. And so, and just quickly, when we aggregate the impact of misinformation versus this vaccine skeptical content, we see that misinformation lowers vaccine intentions by a predicted 0.5 percentage points per user, compared to a vaccine skeptical content lowering vaccine intentions by 2.28 percentage points per user according to our model, which is a 50x difference. And so there's a lot of attention being paid to the red part of this plot. But what's missing is this blue part, this stuff that's not getting caught, that is not being identified. And so what is this content? So the most viewed story on Facebook during this time was actually this one here. And so the headline here is, "A healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine. The CDC is investigating why." This is published by the Chicago Tribune, a Pulitzer Prize-winning outlet. Again, this story is not false. A healthy doctor died, subsequent to getting a COVID vaccine. But at the time, it was not clear what the connection between these two events were. In fact, it was later debunked that these two events were not connected. But nonetheless, this story was seen by over 50 million accounts on Facebook, compared to 9 million accounts, which was the exposure to all misinformation combined. And so this one story was seen 5 times more than all flagged misinformation about the vaccine during this time period on Facebook. And it's not just this one story. There were many examples of coverage of rare vaccine deaths, or deaths following the vaccine, often in healthy young people, published by reputable outlets and local news outlets that got an enormous amount of traction on Facebook, despite not being, again, not false, and not kind of caught by their system, but incredibly popular. And so why is this important? Well, the current interventions around misinformation have been targeting mostly veracity or belief. And when you target veracity or belief, or you try to limit exposure to false content, that might not limit harm. And so interventions like accuracy nudges, debunking, digital literacy that's focusing on emphasizing the source and source credibility labels might be effective when what you're worried about is the egregiously false Pope endorses Donald Trump style content, but isn't going to work on this gray area content, from the Chicago Tribune, for example. And just to sum up, we do see that misinformation has a large negative impact on vaccine intentions compared to factually accurate content when people see it. But people don't see this very much. And it is instead this gray area vaccine skeptical content that had a much bigger impact on vaccine intentions than these outright false claims. And if platforms identified content based on its predicted harmful impact, rather than only targeting outright fake information, they could be potentially better prepared to combat the harmful effects. And obviously, there are trade-offs here with interventions in terms of freedom of speech versus the potential for harm. But these trade-offs could be large. And so back-of-the-envelope calculations suggest that limiting exposure to this content could have increased vaccine uptake by up to 3 million people. So it's possible that by not focusing on this content, we're missing a huge part of the picture. And where do I think this work is leading? Well, first, I think that this suggests that we should shift the way that we study misinformation. So instead of studying why misinformation as a noun, we should try to understand why people are making misinformed decisions. And really also put the focus on impact and on harm. The second thing that I think this work suggests, a direction that I think this work suggests we should go, is using a crowd machine pipeline for tracking harmful content at scale. So a benefit of this approach is that we have estimated estimates of harm for all vaccine-related content on Facebook. And you could imagine using the same approach to study any kind of harm, content that makes people angry, content that is polarizing, and using these same approaches to quantify other kinds of harm on the platform. And finally, in terms of solutions, I think we're going to talk about solutions hopefully later today. But one thing that I think has been is a potential solution is community content moderation, where it's not this top-down content moderation that has gotten people that I think raises a lot of eyebrows, but instead projects like Community Notes that are leveraging the power of community to add context to potentially this gray area content. And with that, I'm done. I guess we'll save questions for this section at the end. If people are interested in the paper, it's here. Thanks. Oh, maybe one question? Yes.
Amazing talk. I will cite it all the time. It definitely conforms to my experience, and I worked on the COVID defense stuff at Meta after this, and it definitely was spot on. And it also tracks many other problems we had, including polarizing content. I guess I just wanted to throw one idea at you in terms of mitigations. So, what do you think about? So one of the things that was actually most effective in the area of COVID defense was sort of reducing the weights of reshares in the algorithm, because a lot of times, it would affect back the misinformation, but because it's an indirect mitigation, it also affects all the other stuff that is. And so that might be one way to address these kinds of things that address, the things in that direction that are sort of misleading, as opposed to looking at things that are just fact-checked by fact checkers. Just curious what you think about that direction of trying to make the system resilient to this broader category, as opposed to trying to figure out what are the things that are actually vaccine skeptical.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I think there's metrics can be used for different reasons. So one approach, for example, if you're interested in understanding where harm is coming from, this could be a helpful way to identify, where potential vaccine hesitancy is emerging from. That doesn't mean that you need to intervene on that ranking. Or you don't need to rank based on this kind of predicted harm. Maybe people would have problems with that in terms of freedom of speech and things like that, and I think those are very legitimate concerns. So I think exactly what you're saying is finding other ways, using these kinds of metrics to identify patterns, and then using other levers like resharing. I think there's like different ways of ranking that could, again, address this kind of content as a whole. I think that it's harmful, non-violating content, I think, is maybe the term that people at Facebook use for this kind of content. And I think it is, there's election denial narratives, and I think that understanding kind of broadly the levers to use is the real question here. Great.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here again. I was at the event last year, and a lot of what's in this talk was actually informed over the year by what I heard. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I do at Jigsaw, which is a unit within Google, about using AI techniques to promote more meaningful dialogue in the public square, and I'll talk a little bit about ways we're thinking about defining that. So first, what is Jigsaw? We're a pretty unique unit within Google, about 30 people or so, focus actually not on Google products, but broader issues in the information ecosystem and threats to open societies. We both research the kind of foundations of those issues and build and prototype scalable solutions to address them. So I'm a UX researcher within the R&D team that shapes those solutions. One of our kind of flagship efforts, just for context, is Perspective API, which is a free-to-use API that uses machine learning to identify toxic comments to make it easier to host better conversations, hosted on Google Cloud. At its most basic level, you send it some text, and it will give you a probability score for whether it's toxic or meets a number of other attributes. This is available in across 18 languages and used by a bunch of the kinds of partners you see here. One of the more recent questions we've been thinking about at Jigsaw is not just harms like toxicity, but actually thinking about how can you reshape public squares online and offline for the better, harnessing some even newer AI techniques. So again, as I said, that same question alone raises sub-questions such as what are different kinds of public squares that you might focus on, and what does it mean to make those better? So first, we draw heavily on some of the work of Habermas to define this idea of a public sphere, which can take many forms. As you can see here, Habermas defines it as a realm of social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed and where access is guaranteed to all citizens. He first wrote about this sphere a few decades ago, and there are many more kinds of squares than even when he first wrote about that. One framework that we've used for thinking about it is three types of public squares. So you have what you might traditionally think of as spaces for civic discussion, like, say, town halls, citizen assemblies, to deliberate on civic matters. But media is also a kind of public square where you have places like commenting spaces on publisher sites to inform some of that other decision-making and deliberation. And then, of course, social spaces, so anything from online forums to private chats and other communities where people kind of ambiently are also forming that public opinion. So Jigsaw has been working in the last year or so to improve public squares in a few ways. One, towards the beginning of the year, we hosted a convening that I know at least some people in this room were at to kind of take on this question of what we mean by a public square and how AI could fit into that. So feel free to find me after this. We have a preprint coming with some of the takeaways along a bunch of different dimensions, dozens of authors, really excited to get that out there. We've also funded an ecosystem of deliberative tech with Google.org at the tune of around $20 million. This is starting with AI and democracy initiatives in Europe, so kind of supercharging the orgs that are already doing some of this stuff. And finally, within the Jigsaw team, we've been researching and prototyping some new techs around using LLMs to improve deliberations at scale. So, for example, if you're trying to elicit public opinion on an issue in your town, how do you make sense and moderate those responses? Figuring some people might troll, there might be duplication. So we're really taking on those issues of doing that kind of thing at scale. But what I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on that quantifying question today is in that media bucket, in particular for publisher comment sections. And so I'm going to talk about a case study that I think I first teased last year around using qualities for bridging divides, bridging conversations in publisher spaces. So what is bridging? Another definition here, we draw from the bridging systems definition of Ivo Vadya and Luke Thurburn, that bridging systems aim to increase mutual understanding and trust across divides, creating space for productive conflict. We drew from them and many other researchers in conflict transformation to really ask ourselves, like, what does it look like to, again, have meaningful conversation where conflict can lead to better outcomes and not devolve into the kind of toxicity and hate that we're so used to seeing. So drawing from that, last year we publicly released 7 initial different aspects of bridging, knowing that it can be more than one thing. So you can see here this includes things like, there's so many I have to double check here, affinity, compassion, reasoning, nuance, personal stories, and yeah, we have others in development as well. So these can be used both just to score, similar to like what you saw with Perspective API for toxicity, but they can also be the basis for a number of interventions like sorting or re-ranking. You can see in this little animation here, which is drawing from real news comments, a little demo of what it might look like to re-rank this conversation about minimum wage hikes, not just by recency, but maybe you want to highlight what are the kinds of questions and aspects of curiosity that people are drawing upon, what are the kind of specific points or constructive reasoning. So that's just a brief demo of what you might do there. Apologies. Yeah. We also released a data set of how we created those attributes, which was actually in this kind of in-depth collaborative process with raters, much more qualitative than traditional crowd rating, knowing that what these concepts even are is not always obvious. You know, this isn't, these get to be very complex social constructs, and so we kind of went back and forth with raters to refine what we actually meant by those, and you can read more about that process in this paper here. I also did some research trying to understand 4 different kinds of applications like re-ranking, what do they actually do? So in the study that I also talked about last year, created this Figma prototype of a comment section drawing from 2 New York Times articles, one for a dining article, one was a politics op-ed, and we wanted to see in a few conditions, how would people actually respond to these these comments differently. You know, were they having the kind of effects we hypothesized of actually making people feel increasing understanding and participation. So specifically, and this was kind of our first pass at some of the outcome types we were interested in. In contrast to some other areas, there wasn't necessarily like one clear North Star that we knew of for better conversations. And the more we thought of it, we realized there's really multiple dimensions to that, and they may not all move together. So we were interested in things like, you know, can more people feel comfortable to participate in a comment section based on these different rankings? So things like perceived likelihood of hostility or respect for new commenters. How trustworthy and informative did the comment section? That's obviously different than the actual kind of factual content of the comments, which is another question, but we thought we'd start with just that perceived credibility. And then engagement, we weren't doing behavioral tracking, but tried to get a sense of kind of predicted interestingness, willingness to visit in the future. And then finally, polarization. So for the politics op-ed, did the different rankings change how favorable they thought the section was to Democrats versus Republicans? And so there's a preprint out of some of the things we found, and as we predicted, not everything did move together. So we did see some significant effects, particularly for constructiveness, which is now named reasoning, and curiosity for things like respect, trustworthiness, and interest. But some of the engagement outcomes were much more mixed. And we also saw huge differences by the content type. So the dining article looked almost completely different. If you have a bunch of people asking questions as they're talking about restaurant reviews, that looks very different than people asking questions about, you know, what is the nature of this political disagreement? So the context really matters. So this has informed some of our future thinking on how these might be applied. And as I said, that was just our first pass at kind of thinking about how to measure outcomes of, you know, what is a better conversation. There have since, or even leading up to that, been a lot of other frameworks for thinking about this. And I continue to ask, or we continue to ask ourselves, and I continue to ask you, what are those ideal outcomes to optimize for? So a few other frameworks that we think about a lot. One is from the Pro-Social Ranking Challenge, which is a large experiment with a bunch of different kinds of algorithms to re-rank feeds using a live browser extension on a few platforms. So we have some conditions running on that now, and you can see the outcomes are somewhat similar, things like conflict, well-being, information, and engagement. So yeah, you can see that maps sort of to how we were thinking about polarization, information, behavioral data for engagement, and with the new addition of well-being, which in retrospect I think is a great thing to add in there. There's this other framework called civic signals, which was defined after some research led by the New Public team and UT Austin Center for Media Engagement, where through both kind of qualitative interviews and global surveys, they came up with these kind of building blocks for flourishing online spaces that include things like being welcoming, connective, and understanding. And so you can see that also sort of maps to some of the things we were thinking, connecting, when you look at the definition as something does relate to conflict, can you kind of bring divides together? Welcoming new participation, understanding of information. So we're starting to see a lot of, or some initial convergence on some of the things we might be talking about when we talk about better conversations. And then still a lot of different methods for how do you actually measure those. So this was something, especially coming out of last year's conference, there was a lot of discussion of kind of the limitations of some of the status quo methods of, say, intercept surveys with low response rates, or kind of traditional ways to measure some of these outcomes, and wondering if there could be more scalable or thorough ways to do this. So this was a really great paper that came out last year about non-engagement signals and content ranking that I think does a nice job of breaking up some possible options, in particular pointing to things like item level surveys, which are those kind of, could be that kind of intercept type survey thing, but also things like quality metrics, which maybe you end up using these bridging attributes or perspective API as a way to evaluate as well the changes in the conversations. So that's something we're also still thinking through and looking for, I think similar to the outcomes, knowing that these metrics might also tell different parts of a story. So what's next? In addition to some of those re-ranking extension studies I mentioned, we'll have a case study forthcoming soon with live A/B testing on actually a number of publisher sites, so very excited to share some of the insights from that. That was kind of the natural next step after doing that more lab-like study. And yeah, going back to that kind of civic public square question, or actually across all of them, thinking about not just classifiers, but using LLMs to maybe more dynamically develop customizable moderation by community-specific norms and rules. And yeah, we're thinking about those outcomes and metrics not just for these media spaces, but also civic and social spaces. So some of the ones that we're thinking about when it comes to those deliberations and civic conversations, maybe there it's even more important to think about things like individual voice. Do you feel like your opinion has been seen and heard in a deliberation? Group social cohesion, attitudes for across a group, and public trust. So open questions for you all and myself. So yeah, what are those best outcomes and metrics to understand these very aspirational goals like bridging and meaningful conversation? And how much does standardizing them actually matter? So that's sort of an implicit question as I show all those frameworks. My personal opinion is, at least in polarization, there's started to be more of a kind of shared language around outcomes that's been very fruitful, as seen in things like the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which was a large paper where a bunch of different researchers were able to compare interventions according to that same language of outcomes and metrics. I think something for better conversations. I know the Pro-Social Ranking Challenge is aspiring to that, but I think there's more work we can do to kind of align on what we mean there. And yeah, how that might differ in different types of public squares. And finally, in thinking about some of those measurement and method questions, how can we best enable really ecologically valid, independent, and open research, especially on some of these platform-dependent metrics, like engagement, without requiring large teams and lots of engineers having to rebuild some of these things from scratch. So another paper actually coming out about that pretty soon. But yeah, that is it. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions about any of this kind of work in AI and the public square or anything else.
find a lot of meaning or like learning from YouTube. There's like a lot of negative
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think some of the frameworks like that, Civic Signals, like did look very specifically across different platform types to come up with those big buckets. But of course, you're right that there's a lot of variation within that. And I think that's the right way to think of it according to those different goals of like, and even within a platform, right? Like Reddit has advice giving kind of communities and support group kind of communities. And within those different spaces, yeah, there might be different goals or things that might be considered better conversation. And I think we saw even a little bit of that in the dining versus news comparison, that people had different information goals and sensibilities. So, I mean, that's making me think, you know, I sort of framed it like, what are the high-level outcomes as if there would just be a few top-down. But I think that's maybe also a question that could be bottom-up from some of these spaces and some of those members around, yeah, what their own goals are.
It'd be really interesting to see like what are the universal truths about meaningful content or meaningful conversation versus like what is context dependent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Restarted from the beginning. Okay, my name is still Jonas Schoene. I'm still a postdoc at Stanford University, and today we are talking about how we can measure well-being on a population level using social media data. Let's again imagine you are the president of a fictional country just like that one, and you want to find out whether or not you're actually doing a good job in the last few years. Something that you've traditionally would have looked at, which is basically the standard metric for societal growth, has been the GDP and the household income of the population that you're basically the president of. But in an ideal world, you also really care about how people feel in your country, the well-being of your population. And previously, a lot of people have used GDP to approximate well-being, but there's a lot of criticism to do this. And there has been now an over a decade-long push by both the OECD and the UN that made these sustainability goals that we now need to measure well-being of your population just beyond the GDP. But how would we do this in a country of that size? We could just go around the entire country, ask people with phone surveys or online surveys, and just ask them with self-reports how they would feel. But this is both cost-intensive as well as it's resource-intensive and also time-consuming. And there is a need for a new measurement. And the UN, in the same document where they proposed to use data beyond the GDP, they actually specified basically these three goals that this kind of new measurement should have. It should be accurate, timed in with a high spatial resolution, meaning that there's a comprehensive collection of all the people in your country, all across the US in this example. So instead of using these super tedious self-report data, we might be able to use data that already exists in this country. And we thought social media, where people put out how they feel and think about their lives and society, and we can potentially harness this information to predict people's well-being down to the county level. But that raises the question, how can we do this? And today I try to give one potential answer on how we could do this. Yes, first of all, we need data. And so we have geolocated tweets, and we only included counties here where we have more than 30 tweets per user, of counties where we have at least 100 users, so we get enough data there, as well as ground truth information. The ground truth here is going to be the Gallup survey. And in total, we collected data from 2009 to 2015. We have 1.6 billion tweets of more than 5 billion people. Of 1,208 counties. These counties make up an approximate 90% of the population of the US, because like the regions where people tweet a lot is the regions where people usually live, and so we have the counties with the bigger populations. So we cover quite extensive or comprehensively the entire US. Now we have this huge amount of data. What can we do with this to best predict well-being? There's multiple steps we need to do. First, there's a few unique things about social media. On social media, there's a few users who create a lot of content. There's also a lot of bots that could skew your prediction. So we want to make sure that each user contributes to this data in a similar extent. So independent of how many tweets a person has, we will aggregate this and turn these into these frequency tables, where we basically have a words and the probability of this word occurring for a user, and they add up to 1. That means that in your data set, each participant is only represented once. So even if you have some bots in there that have like a huge amount of text, they will only contribute once to your data set. And this is the first step of our aggregation process to pre-process this data. This also allows us to do a second really cool thing. Now that we have all the language of these participants, that allows us to predict who are these people, using off-the-shelf tools to predict people's age, gender, education, and income. And there's a good reason for why we might want to do this. Because in social media data, the people aren't represented in the way that the underlying demographics is. So usually on social media, the people tend to be younger, more educated, and usually also more urban. And having these these predicted demographics allows us, using robust post-stratification, to reweight these frequency tables that we had earlier to better represent the underlying demographic of your county. This is the second important step. And finally, now we have these pre-processed data sets of a county with these frequency tables, but there's a lot of language in there. And we want to reduce the dimensionality of this data to have a better prediction model. So we turn these frequency tables of like language of a county into topics using a pre-existing set of 2,000 topics. So we basically know what people talk about in these counties. And we use this information to connect it to the ground truth, which is our Gallup data set, using a 10-fold cross-validation to predict life satisfaction. And we call this the county cross-validation model. Now let's just see how good this is doing. So we have the traditional method of the log median household income, and that correlates to solid 0.4 with the ground truth of well-being. So we can see we can predict well-being, but only to 0.4. And our county cross-validation model is stronger than that, which is a really good signal. We can also now estimate how much we actually gain using this post-stratification model of reweighting our data set to the underlying to the underlying demographics, and we gain quite a bit doing this post-stratification method. And even without post-stratification, we're still better than the traditional method of using log median income. But you might be now saying, my entire pitch kind of started with, we don't want to rely on having ground truth. And this county cross-validation model still uses this data in order to even build it. So we might want to find a model that doesn't need this ground truth to be built. And that is where the second method comes into play, which we call the person level model. Instead of having this large ground truth data, we now zoom in on the person level. So we have Twitter users for which we have both the users' tweets as well as their well-being data. There's this website, the Authentic Happiness Project, where people can log in, fill out surveys about their own well-being, and they are also able to give us their Twitter handles. And back in the day when we could still use the API, we're able to connect the well-being survey with the actual Twitter data that they have, so we can basically map this with 9,400 people to build an external dictionary that is predicting people's well-being based on their direct language. And we can use this dictionary and similarly apply this to the same data set that we previously extracted the topics from, and just apply our well-being dictionary to predict well-being. And how well is, just to quickly compare this in case this was all a bit too much for one slide. So for a county cross-validation, we have this pre-processed data set, extract the topics, and this is what we use to predict our life satisfaction. With the person level model, we first need to build an external dictionary, an external model, apply this to the same pre-processed data set, and then compare this to the ground truth. Here we also use the ground truth, but only to validate, only to test how good our model is actually doing. So how well is it doing? We find that we are still better than the traditional method of the median household income. But without the post-stratification, we are not better anymore. So we need to do all of the pre-processing steps here for this model to perform better than the log median income. But it's still impressive to see that the person level model can beat the income, considering how much less data we needed to build it. Something we would care about as policymakers and researchers alike is that our outcome of our life satisfaction correlates with other outcomes that we care about. Physical inactivity, adult obesity, like other health and mental health outcomes. And we can see self-report correlates to like a medium extent around about 0.4 with all of these outcomes. And here's one of the kickers of this presentation, that the county cross-validation model is better at predicting external outcomes than the life satisfaction self-reports that was used to build it. So we can capture more information about people's lives in their language than we can from a single self-report data, because people talk about what they do, with whom they're connected, their activities, and this information then correlates better with like their physical and mental health outcomes than a single question, how do you feel, are you satisfied with your life? And I think that is a really good opportunity here. And the same is true for the person level model. Next, we want to find out what are we predicting here? What are people talking about who are high on life satisfaction? And basically, being at a conference is one of the things that predict high life satisfaction. Having a career or like doing research apparently is really good for you. And we can see that this is obviously face valid. But let's just look also at other topics here. So these are the topics that we extracted that highly correlate with high life satisfaction, and these really neatly map onto previous literature. We can see that there's the social engagements, there's recreation and traveling, and also goal pursuit. And these are all things we would expect to predict high life satisfaction. They all map on neatly to that language. And this is something that language can capture, which isn't captured in the single question, like what is your life satisfaction? I think that is a really good demonstration of their face validity. But a measure is only worthwhile if you can have retest reliability, and the ground truth has a 0.7 retest reliability, which is exactly the same what we would find with our cross-validation model. We do find slightly higher retest reliability with our person level model. The reason for this is that for our cross-validation model, when we create these two new time bins, we train a new model essentially, while for the person level model, we have the same model that we trained previously and apply it to the entire data set at once. That's why potentially the retest reliability here is a little higher. But it's good, it's higher, or at least as high as the self-reported data. But there's other countries, believe it or not, one of them is the UK, and we want to test whether or not the same approaches would work in a different context. So we see our familiar graph here again. The log median income in the UK doesn't predict life satisfaction to the same extent as it does in the US. But the more problematic thing is that the person level that was trained on US people, so the Authentic Happiness Project is mostly used by people here in the US, that doesn't map onto the people in the UK as much. And that's also one of the takeaways, is that stay excited for the preprint that comes out soon, where we dive into the details of when do errors occur in this type of analysis. One of them is certainly if you have people in your model training that aren't in the test set, then your prediction model will not be as good. But our county cross-validation model that is trained in the same way but on UK data still works just fine. Just to quickly summarize what we found, we can see for our county cross-validation method that it both correlates with self-reports, with other outcomes, it's stable over time, and even works in the UK. And similar it looks for the person level model, but doesn't work in the UK. But I would expect that if we would have a model where we have the person within the UK, and we would have trained it this way, we probably would have found it, but this is just suspicion. Yes, so where does this leave us? So with this method, we have the promise that we could evaluate well-being. For example, policies. You could see how well-being of your country changes over time, because The data on social media is continuous, so you could track over time how people would change. But not only for policymakers this is interesting, but also for unpredicted events you could now track how people would feel. Because you not always have a self-report measure ready when something unexpected happens, but on social media you can go slightly back in time and still apply the same measure and see how people would feel. But also for research, you don't only need to do this with well-being. There's other interesting concepts, loneliness, for example, collectivism, that you could do with both this extensive method where you have like a ground truth on a county level, but also on a smaller scale where you just have like a person level where you have both the Twitter data as well as the self-reported data, and you could do interesting analysis on a country level. But unfortunately, these opportunities are going away. And one of those reasons is that some people don't want us to have that kind of data. So we also want to use this project kind of as a flag to like push for getting more access to this data again. The European Union has now this Digital Service Act where they actually require companies to give access to the data. And we feel like this paper is just a testament to how much this is indeed needed. And with this, I want to thank all the great people that worked on that project to make it happen. Yeah.
I'd be curious what other type of data sources you ideally would love to get your hands on other than Twitter data, given that Twitter usage is not necessarily always population level representative.
That is a good question. Personally, like Twitter data would be a good start to have that again. Ideally, other websites as well, like Facebook, would be, because like exactly as you said, the users that use certain platforms that aren't represented in the same way. Post-stratification is one way to get a handle on this, especially like on Twitter, there's not as many older people than there are on Facebook. This method still makes it possible, but I think another interesting data source would be, that's actually a good question. I'm not sure which other text we could need. Facebook is certainly one of the ones. Like the broader use by society, the better it would be, essentially. Yeah.
Do you think the failure to replicate in the UK is about, I mean, clearly it's about not training it on the same data, but are there cultural norms where Americans are more likely to say, like, so excited to be at an opportunity like this conference today, which I've tweeted 5 times already, and also a powerful desire to be happy, which, I mean, not to say that folks in other countries don't desire to be happy, but it's not maybe as much of an explicit goal that you want to tweet about or show that you're happy. You know what I'm saying? So what are the cultural differences?
The cultural, I think that's probably pretty spot on. I think that is probably one of the main reasons there's a cultural difference, and B, also a difference in how people use the language. But I think if that's exactly what I meant by, like, if we would get the person level in the UK, we would probably capture this cultural difference that we don't have in the moment. But it's probably a question for future research. Something that we also see in this data set is that if you look into counties where the composition of people is a little bit different, like for example, you have like a higher percentage of Hispanics in that region, the prediction model also goes down because people use language in a different way. I think that is pretty much spot on, yeah.
I have a related question. Thanks for your talk. Do you see any items that are negatively correlated with your metrics? Because I was thinking if people are self-selecting to take a survey and fill out how happy they feel, I'd be interested to hear what's negatively corred with these outcomes.
Can you, I'm not sure if I follow the question. Like, do you mean in, like, for example, these topics? Are you interested in finding topics? Some of the topics that are related to low life satisfaction, we will have this in the supplementary material of the actual paper. It's like if people use a lot of swear words, there's just like an indication of like that people are in a bad place, essentially.
I'm just kind of curious. It seems like you would have a lot of this data, but maybe less of the swear words. What does that data look like? Do you have more words that are positively valenced?
There is more as well. Not in the slide deck, unfortunately.
I'll follow up.
I guess one question, and then we open it up to sort of all the speakers. So the Gallup data is like purportedly representative, right? But there are many kinds of, like, this is building on Jen's question. There are many kinds of self-reports that have a lot more selection bias in them, right? So polls, for example, right? The people who are responding to presidential polling. So how would you, like, what do you think is the relationship between the predictive validity of these, of this kind of technique versus that self-report? So do you need accurate self-reports to, like, build these kinds of models, or could these models eclipse self-reports when the self-reports are, like, inherently biased by selection? So, like, do you think that your data would better predict like presidential or Senate or gubernatorial kinds of elections, like maybe potentially, than a poll that's like trying to get people who will respond to a pollster?
That's a good question. I think we can't train a model on like a concept if we have the concept not labeled correctly. So we do need to have, like, if we want to, I think that this poll example is pretty good because we don't, like, the people who wouldn't fill out the poll, they're also like really influential in there, and we would need to know something about them, otherwise the model wouldn't know anything about them. Unless we have a proxy that could help us identify these, maybe not, we don't ask them about voting, but maybe people are more likely to talk about political identity, so we can predict people's identity and then approximate how likely this would be for them to vote. But we would still need to get a measure on like some sort of a ground truth at some point, otherwise we would learn from the wrong thing, essentially. I think that is my take on that.
Okay.
Follow-up question on that same table, the upper left corner, where you had things that, or stories that were expected to have a negative effect on vaccination, but actually had a positive effect on vaccination. What were those stories like? Those were ones that were surprisingly.
Yeah, I would say that I think each of the treatment effects was measured with like sampling error, and so I think it's my guess is sampling error. I think that there's no consistent story that I could tell about things that people thought would have a negative effect that had a surprisingly positive effect, except for it was, I would guess, just noise. Does that make sense?
There's no story that has a surprisingly positive effect for you?
That has a surprisingly positive effect. I think there's nothing that I can recall at this moment. The data was mostly negative. I think that there were some negative stories that had null effects that I was kind of surprised by. And so, a lot of stuff about mandates, like someone coming and knocking at your house and banging on the door and telling you to get a vaccine, I think had, people thought that would be negative, I guess, maybe just because, but that had, I think, a null effect, if not a slightly positive effect, even though it was kind of misleading.
That's interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer, I have one more question. I was curious if you could say a little bit more about these sort of posts that were not misinformation, but that still have sort of this large influence on people. I'm particularly curious about, do you have a sense of what categories they fall into? For example, the examples you showed about like people who died from taking vaccines seems like sort of, I mean, posts that sort of amplify a very unlikely event, and so I'm curious because sort of we know that people are really bad at reasoning about probabilities, and so is that what explains it for that category? But is that where most of these posts that sort of lie? Is that sort of about misestimation of probability, or what are other categories. So I'm curious.
Yeah, so a lot of the stories are like these rare vaccine deaths. I think that's, a large proportion. I think there was also stories, of widespread vaccine refusal by healthcare workers, for example. Stories that were like amplifying hesitancy in minority populations, that we're saying that there's something that's like, oh, is this another Tuskegee experiment or something like that? Like, these populations have these questions. It wasn't necessarily, and it was not. Again, these are scenarios where it's not false. It's potentially misleading, but sometimes I think it's not necessarily misleading. It's a hard gray area space to define, I think. And so, yeah, but there are some, I think, patterns that you see that I think we could do more to combat. And so I think these kind of rare events and this connection, it wasn't clear that this person died because of the COVID vaccine, and these kinds of connections between these things that are like seem temporally related but might not be, I think was also a big pattern that we saw.
Thank you.
I have a question for Jonas. So yeah, very nice talk. As you know, there's a lot of debate about what happiness actually is, and you're able to sidestep some of those thorny questions by focusing on a self-reported measure of well-being, which is absolutely appropriate. But at the same time, your data has a lot of interesting insights, right? You showed us that word cloud plot where you've got goals and conferences and work and all that. So I'm wondering, as a psychologist, like, can you use this data and this pipeline to shed light on what are the dimensions of happiness, the multiple dimensions of happiness, not just a singular self-reported well-being?
On already? Hello? Yeah. Actually, I think that is the hope for the next step with this data. This is basically just like a proof of principle. And now I think in the next project should focus on these psychological dimensions. Personally, I was extremely interested in like how loneliness fits into that story. But there's also you could also look into what the influence of certain happiness factors are. Like how important is social activities for people in certain parts of the country? Like for example, you find that there's these there's certain population that's a bit more rural that is extremely happy. And you can try to understand what makes certain people happy by looking into the topics that they talk about. Is there something that you personally would be interested in looking at?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a fascinating problem. I mean, understanding the structure of a construct like happiness using large-scale data. I mean, that's really, I would say, the goal of this quantified society topic that we have. So, yeah, excited to see what you do next with it.
Yes, especially interesting because in these huge data collection efforts like the Gallup, you don't get the opportunity to ask how much do you socialize? So if there's a more if there's different constructs that you're interested in, they're not necessarily there, but they might be in there. And also this person level model has this opportunity to, if you have a very specific, maybe even novel idea, you could just train this on a smaller set of 10,000 people and then spin this out using this larger data set that we already have. And I think that is a great opportunity to see how this influences well-being on a country level over time.
Thank you.
One question for Emily and for Jennifer, and I guess it also picks up on Jonas. So in this kind of quantification, it seems from Jennifer's data that the crowdsourcing is more accurate for negative kinds of events. I'm curious, I'm sure that I'm presupposing that Jigsaw built toxicity measures before they built meaningful measures. Is it easier, is there more agreement from your perspective across these on what the quantification of negative states than positive states? So if you think about, if we're trying to go back and think about pulling out universal truths about quantifying, is it easier for us to see what people don't like than what they do like? Or can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think part of what explains at least in Jigsaw's case with Perspective API, the focus on negative to start, is that feels more of like an urgent, like the house is burning kind of issue to focus on. But I think, I mean, at least in terms of detection, I think it's equally complex and contextual. But it is interesting. We've also been doing some interviews and research with community moderators and seeing firsthand that while there are goals that people have both for supporting and boosting the community as well as protecting or shielding them from harm, that kind of shielding negative aspect is the one they really hate and like want to deal with if possible in more like automated ways. So at least in terms of like technology development, that explains it. But yeah, I personally, I don't have specific evidence to back this up, except that, well, I guess thinking about our annotation processes for like having people figure out concepts like moral outrage or alienation, those are just as tricky and complex as the positive ones. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your response.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point that I hadn't necessarily thought about. I think it does seem true that it's easier, at least for me as a person doing it, to identify the bad content, the negative content. And so we did a similar thing that we did with this vaccine hesitancy stuff with politically polarizing content. And so we had crowds rate content as being polarizing or not. And I think that it's really hard to think about what kind of content is depolarizing. And there was really not a lot of agreement compared to the stuff that was polarizing. I think it's the things that people would expect. Or the consensus was around things that expressed anger, out-group denigration, things like that. But when you think about depolarizing stuff, there was not as kind of consistent of a story. And I don't know to what extent that is universal, but it does seem like that's potentially something that you've hit on that we should look into more.
Cool. I had a question for Emily. You're sort of aware that in the non-engagement paper and in other settings, we try to argue that there's a business case for using some of these post-social outcomes. I was excited that you sort of following last year's introduction of these things, we actually have data of, what do these things do in the wild? Are you seeing any evidence that the use of these pro-social APIs might lead to better long-term retention outcomes that might help the business case?
The jury is out, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to publicly say the data yet, except to say that I think I can say it's mixed, but not negative. It's not, it's neither a magic bullet nor a, like, dunk on engagement. And yeah, I think especially when you think about longer-term retention, something has been encouraging for me to see is you talk to publishers, you talk to platforms, they recognize this too. I think there's a sort of cynical assumption that like platforms would never do some of these more pro-social things because it would like outrage sells, baby. Like you get all the clicks and the shares. But I think platforms also see that turns people away over time, and actually drawing on your statement the places that people find well-being, it's not just harmful for their brand to over-optimize for the momentary happiness, but yeah, actually for their well-being. So I think we are seeing more awareness of that within the organizations for some of these approaches.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, Emily, and Johannes.